Welcome, everyone. Today, my guest is Dr. Natalie Danner, and she is the Early Childhood Content and Engagement Coordinator for the Illinois Early Learning Project. She has worked as an early childhood teacher, educator in Nebraska, Oregon, and Connecticut. Dr. Danner has over 10 years of experience as an inclusive early childhood pre-K to K teacher and school leader in New York City and Arizona, specializing in the Montessori approach. She earned her Ph.D. in early childhood special education from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and her research focuses on how teachers support young children with disabilities in their inclusive classrooms, as well as the creation and adoption of the early intervention, early childhood special education personnel preparation, teacher education standards. Welcome, Dr. Danner.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be with you today.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm so excited to talk to you today. How did you get started in the early childhood education field?
So I guess I got started when I first started working in a summer camp that happened to be a Montessori school. I was a freshman in college and it was summertime and I needed a job, and this happened to be one of those out there, and I decided to try it out. And I was fascinated with the self-confidence of the children and the materials that they were using. And this was just something that I had to learn more about. So when I went back to my sophomore year of university, I decided to switch my major to education from international business. And
it's a big change.
I know it was a big change. And after my undergraduate degree, after I graduated with elementary education, I went for my Montessori training. And it all started with, a part-time job in the summer and just gaining some experience in a Montessori classroom. And it changed my outlook on both education and my career path. So it started just with a summer job.
That is awesome. So a summer job can change your life.
Yes.
And this podcast is coming out during summertime. And my virtual background, I was hoping to inspire summer in all of us. It's an outdoor movie theater. You can see the reel. And Dr. Danner showed me that it has a bag of popcorn.
You can just popcorn imagine. Up there.
What's that?
The popcorn's up there. Yep.
The popcorn. And we can just imagine the power and potential that 3 months in the summer can have on a person. And so you talked about Montessori. What is Montessori?
That is the essential question. And it's a hard one to answer for sure. But my short answer is that Montessori is a philosophy of education. It was developed by Dr. Maria Montessori in the early 1900s, and it focuses on choice, hands-on materials, individualized learning, and multi-age classrooms. And I could go on and on and on, but that's my short answer.
That's your short answer. So what drew you to Montessori, and what's your favorite thing about the approach?
I think my favorite thing is really the idea of the respect for the child. So children in Montessori classrooms aren't seen as blank slates. They're active learners. They make decisions as to what they learn, which is not necessarily a traditional type of education. They move around the classroom. They talk with their peers. They talk with adults. And they make choices in the classroom. And sometimes when we're thinking about early childhood education, we might think, oh yeah, that happens in all early childhood classrooms. The part that's a little bit different in Montessori is that there are very few whole group lessons. There are very few whole group activities. Most of the learning happens when a teacher gives a lesson, either one-on-one or in a small group. And then the child has the opportunity to practice and practice that lesson until they gain mastery in the activity. So you'll see many times if you walk into a Montessori classroom, you'll see that the teacher might be hard to find because the teacher might be sitting on the floor working with a small group. The teacher is not necessarily the focus of the classroom. The teacher is more in the background and might be observing the children or giving a lesson one-on-one or in a small group. So the part that makes it different is that there really isn't those whole group lessons. And it helps because that's part of the individualized part of the Montessori education. The activities and the lessons are tailored directly to where each child is developmentally.
Great, that is awesome. And I love that idea that we're individualizing for children, and that that it might be hard to find the teacher, like you said, because the teacher is amongst the children doing things either one-on-one or with small groups. So that's one of the things about the approach that make it identifiable. And can you talk a little bit about the materials also? Because I think if someone were to walk into a Montessori classroom, that's another thing that might look a little different.
Sure. I can talk about the materials, but in order to talk about the materials, you have to kind of envision the room. And the room would have a multi-age class. And if we're talking about early childhood classrooms, we might be talking about 3, 4, and 5-year-olds all together in one classroom. So what traditionally would look like preschool, pre-K, and kindergarten children all learning together in the same classroom. There would be one teacher who would be the trained Montessori adult, and there might be an assistant or 2 assistants, or sometimes in very large classes, 3 assistants, who would be also supporting the children in the classroom. And the activities that you see on the shelves, or the Montessori materials, would be able to meet the needs of all of the children in the class. So regardless of where a child is developmentally and what they're academically ready for, there are materials in the room that will help them learn a variety of concepts. So when you go into the math area of the classroom, so each of the areas of the classroom has a curriculum area per se. So in the math area, you might have activities where there's one-to-one correspondence for some of the early learning of math skills for those 3-year-olds. And it would go all the way up to perhaps multiplying with beads. And that could be something that a kindergartner is learning. And what makes it different than perhaps your typical elementary or kindergarten type curriculum is all the materials are hands-on. So there are manipulatives for every single material. And that's because Dr. Maria Montessori observed children in a scientific way and learned that children, especially young children, need that concrete experience before they move to abstraction with ideas. So instead of doing worksheets and thinking about math in an abstract way, 8 times 8, and you have it written on the paper equals, and doing the math in their head, perhaps, or doing the math via memorization. Instead, the children who are working with the multiplication material are using beads and seeing concretely how 8 times 8 looks, feels, and is in the environment. And it's a way that children learn from their muscle memory as well as visually. So it's a multisensory approach, and it has very good outcomes for children because they remember using those beads as they grow and as they learn and as they go into elementary and middle school and high school, because it sticks with them. So that memory of using beads to add numbers or subtract or multiply stays with them as a visual and as a muscle memory activity so that it helps them build on those skills so that they can do more complex math and algebra and those sort of things. And I'm only speaking about math here, but I could be speaking about a variety of subjects and how that builds from concrete to more abstract. And many people have the question of, does Montessori go on? Because a lot of people think Montessori might only be for the preschool years. But what's interesting to note is that Montessori exists for infant and toddler programs, for preschool kindergarten classrooms, and as you go up, elementary, middle, and high schools are available within the US that are Montessori based. And just like the early childhood classroom, all of those classrooms are multi-age. So as you go up in the elementary years, it's first through third grade. Sometimes they do third through sixth. Middle school is together, and then secondary, they have a multi-age approach there as well. So it looks obviously different in the classroom as you move up in ages. And the reason why that is the materials are obviously different because they're meeting different developmental needs of the children, but also socially as you change and grow, as you age up, right? Things get different too. So in the elementary years, you'll see more independent small group learning and that sort of thing. Whereas in the early childhood years, a lot more of the activities happen with children independently working in the classroom with themselves at a table with an activity. They might be working near a friend, but they each have their own activity that they're working on. So a longer answer to a complex question there.
Thank you, Dr. Danner. And I have students who are going to be watching this, and
Sure.
maybe they're wondering, how does one become a Montessori teacher? So how do you get into the field?
Sure. So, yeah, I'd love to answer that question. So first, I would say that for students, Montessori can be an option for you. So just like for me, I started as in a summer camp in a Montessori school with a summer job. But for anyone, if you're curious about the Montessori approach, what I recommend that you do is that you go online, find a Montessori school that might be near you, and ask to set up an observation. See what it's all about. Set up an observation with their front desk person. Say, can I come on a school day and see how the classroom runs? And you'll be amazed and see in the classroom what I'm talking about with the Montessori materials, with the multi-age classrooms. And sometimes seeing is the first way to get curious about it. And there are many different approaches in early childhood. So I encourage you to try and see lots of different approaches, because there may be one out there that's not Montessori that you're more drawn to, and that's okay too. But if you are drawn to Montessori, what I would say is get some experience with children as you're going through your program, whether that's in a Montessori school or not. Working with children is always a good precursor to before you go to Montessori training. So if you're doing your student teaching, if you're doing some sub work on the side, if you're working in a program in the summers, those are all great things. And then what you do to become a Montessori teacher is after you do your bachelor's degree, you do basically what's like an add-on program. And it can be at a university, or it could be a standalone program. And Montessori teacher education programs, I should say, you start with your BA, and then you learn all of these curricular areas that I've talked about, math. There can be sensorial. You learn all about the materials. You learn how to give the lessons. You learn how to do observation. You learn how to do classroom management. A lot of those things you learn in your teacher education program for Montessori, and that can be a 1-year or a 2-year program after your bachelor's. Sometimes those programs are integrated into a master's. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're standalone. But they all, the reputable ones that are out there, all end up with a credential that's a national credential or an international credential. So the two main organizations that provide teacher education for Montessori teachers, the first is American Montessori Society, and the second is Association Montessori International. And both of them either provide a credential at the end or a diploma at the end. So that's something that you do after your bachelor's degree. You can do it while you're working in your own classroom. That's okay, as long as it's a Montessori school. And most of the time you can do your student teaching, per se, for Montessori in your own classroom if it's a Montessori classroom. So it's a great experience. And it really gets into depth with the philosophy of Montessori, as well as the individual materials that you'll be teaching.
That's great advice. Thank you. And thank you for the information about the professional organizations, American Montessori Society, and as a student, you can even become a member of a professional organization. And it's a great time to do that too, because sometimes there's discounts for students where maybe it costs a little more as a professional, but because students are going to school, it's not as much. So thank you. And I loved your advice, Dr. Danner, about going in and observing. Find some schools if you're interested, and maybe just ask if you can take a tour or sit in on a couple of classes. And that's a great idea for maybe getting some more information about it. And like what I noticed, like what you said, that no two programs are identical. Even under the Montessori umbrella, there's so much variety. And I worked with two in Orlando, and they were both so different and both amazing programs, but they were very unique in the way that they did things, but both of them were definitely Montessori. If you walked into both programs, you would know this is Montessori, but they do things a little differently. And when I was a little girl in preschool, my parents, they couldn't really afford to send me there, but they had me go to a Montessori program when I was a preschooler. And I just remember loving it there as a child. And some of the things that I learned when I was a preschooler, I do with my own daughter, like going around the candle for your birthday each year around the sun. And I've seen that in other Montessori preschools recently. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we used to do that back in the day when I was a preschooler. I just love how some things are timeless and part of the curriculum. And Dr. Montessori started off as a medical doctor in Rome. And I think that's maybe why my mom wanted me to go there, because my family's Italian, and she wanted her children to have that Montessori foundation. So those are great. So if we were to write a headline for the most important topic in Montessori, what would it be today, Dr. Danner?
I would say probably the most important part of Montessori today would be the aspect of individualized learning, because I've seen in so many classrooms the idea of, I've got to fit it in. I have this curriculum. I've got to get to everything. I've got to teach every lesson to the whole group, and everyone has to move along in lockstep with our curriculum. And Montessori is different in that way because of the individualized aspect of education. Oftentimes, because you have that 3-year age span, you as a teacher have that child and those children for 3 years. So you're with the same group. And of course, each year there's, a third of your class moves out and there's a new third of your class that moves in. But the part of it that's amazing is that community is very strong together. You don't have a whole new class in the fall that you have to teach the structure of your classroom, the routines of your classroom to, because 2/3 of your kids are returning. So you have that structure already in place. A third of those children are new and they're getting used to things. But as you teach the curriculum that you have as a Montessori teacher, you have that flexibility of knowing I'll be with this child for 3 years. I'm not going to force the curriculum on them because they have time. They have time to learn, they have time to explore, and they have time to make their own choices within the environment. And they have time to learn from other peers. That's another part that's really important, is that sometimes their friends or their peers might be teaching them some of these lessons because there are older children in the classroom and younger ones. So when you think about a kindergartner with a 3-year-old, they might be the perfect teacher for that 3-year-old. Whereas maybe the adult teacher, they might be less inclined to learn from, or might still be in that no stage. But learning from an older peer they have all the stars in their eyes, and they're like, I just want to be like that 5-year-old. I'll sit down and learn anything from that person because that's who I strive to be as a younger child. So they get to be a really great role model in the classroom. But coming back to individualized education, it's just thinking about that curriculum in a way that's flexible, and it's what that child needs at that time. So there are some children who are, spurring forward and quite advanced perhaps in the math area, but need some additional support in fine motor tasks. That's okay in the classroom because there are that range of Montessori materials that are in the classroom that meet both the range of perhaps a 3-year-old and a kindergartner in the room. So if there's a older child that has some trouble and needs to be perhaps in more beginning stage fine motor activities, that's perfectly fine. They're not ostracized. They're not out of the loop. They're not out of this whole group, and they have something different and they're sitting at a table away from their peers. Everyone in the classroom is working on something different and has their own curriculum path. So when you're thinking about children who are more advanced and children who need more repetition at the beginning stages, those are both celebrated and okay in the Montessori classroom because the curriculum is individualized. So a long way to say that individualized education is a really strong component of Montessori education.
Yes. And your background, your doctorate is in early childhood special education from
Yes.
University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which is an outstanding, amazing school. And there's so many parallels between Montessori approach and individualizing instruction for children who have IEPs or IFSPs. Is that kind of what drew you toward either your work with children with disabilities or delays or children at risk, or vice versa?
Yeah. Well, as a teacher, I always had children with disabilities in my classroom. And I think for the most part, most early childhood teachers do. They have children who are perhaps not yet identified because they're young, and that might be their first classroom experience. But in my case, I had a child when I was, maybe it was my second or third year teaching, who had autism, who already had a diagnosis, who already had an IEP, who was in my classroom. And we were receiving support from occupational therapy, physical therapy, and some developmental support as well. And what I found was that it was looking at his IEP and looking at his goals and thinking about those individualized goals. It was my first time doing that as a teacher and really looking in detail at an IEP and thinking about how do I put those IEP goals and think about integrating them into my classroom curriculum and how I can support this child in achieving those individualized goals. And I thought to myself, we could do this. We have all of the materials in the classroom. We have the peer support that they need. And we have the ability to really have that one-on-one individualization within the curriculum. So it wasn't hard for me to think about the idea of individualizing because we did it for every single child. So just because he in particular had a disability and perhaps was on a different developmental track than another child in the classroom, it didn't stand out to me as this big hurdle or big dilemma for me, because I was thinking about each child on their own developmental path already and thinking about what activities is this child ready for? What lessons do I need to prepare for this child? And I was thinking about that deeply for every child in the classroom. And when I got more information about this child with autism in my classroom, it only helped that he was receiving support from other people because I was able to partner with them and really think about how do these people not only help him, but help me as a teacher grow and expand what I understand to be this disability, where I understand to be individualizing the curriculum. And it really taught me a whole lot as a teacher to really think about how inclusive I really am as a teacher. And that first aspect of including that particular child with a disability influenced me as I had other children with disabilities in my classroom and thinking about, wow, this is a really amazing approach and curriculum and philosophy of education that focuses on individualized education that can support children who are gifted, children with disabilities, and everyone on the spectrum in between. As long as the teacher is, flexible enough and is supportive enough and is doing the observation and the record keeping that they need to do, I think that it can be a wonderful environment for inclusion. And that's really what took me to my research with Montessori and including students with disabilities in Montessori classrooms, because I just thought, wow, this is really a place where this can work really well. And I think not a lot of researchers have really delved deep into what makes it a unique place for inclusion.
Great, thank you. And you've been in the field of early childhood education a while now. Do you have a highlight or something that has been the best thing that's happened so far in your career?
Well, I would say one of the highlights of my career is supporting American Montessori Society in developing what's known as the Montessori Inclusion Endorsement. So basically, we were all hearing within the Montessori community that we were getting lots of children with disabilities, both in public and private Montessori schools. And a lot of the Montessori teachers, as I talked about before, with their preparation, they do their bachelor's degree, then they do the Montessori training. But the Montessori training didn't have a strong emphasis on inclusion or special education or disability at all. It was really focused on, the curriculum and the lessons and the philosophy. And their bachelor's degree didn't have to be in special education or anything like that either. So many of the Montessori teachers were expressing some frustration in the classroom to say, like, I don't know how to do inclusion. I'm not sure how to do this. And I have, several children in my classroom with disabilities. How do I do this? I've never been taught what to do. And so it came to the attention of American Montessori Society that we really need to do something when it comes to professional development for Montessori teachers because there's a need out there. And so we formed a committee of different Montessori educators, teacher educators, special educators, and came together and developed a curriculum that is an addition to the Montessori training. It's about a year-long program where teachers can gain skills and knowledge in best practices for inclusion within their own classroom. So some teachers, like myself, went on to a straight, special education degree. That's what I did after I had been working in the classroom for many years because I knew I needed more information about Montessori or more information about special education and inclusion for my own practices in the classroom and to better support children with disabilities in my own classroom. And we thought, instead of having them do that, or maybe as an alternative to do that, we could create something that's Montessori focused. So that highlights the parts of the Montessori classroom that can be used and used as supports for inclusion in the classroom. So right now, there are two programs that are out there, one in Texas and one in New York, that are offering the Montessori inclusion endorsement. And I'm an instructor for the one in New York. And most of them are doing most things online right now, but there are components that are in person as well. And it's a great opportunity for teachers to really focus their interest on inclusion and to become that person, perhaps in your school, that's the go-to for inclusive practices. So if other teachers have questions, they can come to you and get ideas and that sort of thing. And you can be kind of the expert on like how to partner with other people and who to go to for, an evaluation and how to start that screening process. All of those things are covered in that training. So I think it's a really good step for the American Montessori Society to have taken it. And I'm so proud of our work because it's seeing that work come to fruition now and people start to graduate from those programs.
That is wonderful. Thank you. And was that one of the presentations you had at the conference a couple months ago?
Not this year, but we may have presented on parts of it in previous years at the American Montessori Society conference. It's now called the Montessori event. That's the new name for the conference. But yes, they always have, some of the most popular, from what I hear from AMS, some of the most popular sessions at the Montessori conference or the Montessori event are about inclusion because teachers who come to the conference are seeking those topics out. So it's good to hear that they want to learn more. And it's good to also have those programs and professional development for them to really dive deep into the topic and feel confident and competent in their own classrooms and supporting those students with disabilities.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations. That's
thank you.
Exciting. So how can podcast listeners follow you and your work?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Danner Natalie. So that's DANNER Natalie, NATALIE. Or I have a website too, and that's nataliedanner.org. So it's pretty easy both ways. It's just one has Danner first and one has Danner last. But those are two ways that people can kind of keep up with me. And Twitter, I'm pretty active on. And I think that's how we both met, is through Twitter. We started following each other. So it's a good way to make professional contacts and to collaborate too, because you kind of watch the daily news of what's happening in early childhood. And that's what I do on Twitter, is kind of follow what's going on as far as policies and things that are happening within the state and federally for early childhood education, and then see what people have to say about it as well. And that's how you kind of get to know some of the big people in early childhood and follow them. And it's just a fun way of kind of professional development, at least for me too.
Yes. And I couldn't agree with you more. I learned so many things, and sometimes I can't make it to a conference, but people at the conference are posting on social media, and it's like, man, I wish I would have gone to that conference. It looks so cool. Or I'm glad I'm at least able to kind of follow along what's happening from a distance, even though I can't be there. So yeah, it's really neat. And a lot of conferences now too will have ways to post to social media to follow along if you're not able to make it to the face-to-face event, or if it's a virtual or hybrid.
I'm one of those people too who live tweets at the conference and takes pictures and kind of shares what's going on. So I love to do that because it's just a fun way of both interacting with the presenters and also just interacting with people on Twitter who are interested and might not be at the conference, like you said. But yeah, one of the good ways to do that is find out what the hashtag is for the conference. And then you can follow along, on social media, even if you're not at that conference, because all the tweets should be using whatever the hashtag of the conference is, whether it's, NAYC 2023 or whatever the hashtag is that year. So if you find that out, you'll be able to follow the conference pretty easily.
Yes. And sometimes there are concurrent sessions. And so I might have made the decision to go to one, and then I'm able to see kind of what's going on in the other ones because people are sharing, and it's kind of a nice way to learn what's happening.
Yeah, one of my favorite things actually from our COVID times now is that conferences seem to be becoming more flexible and more of a hybrid format, which I really appreciate. And I think it's a little bit more inclusive when we're talking about adults with disabilities too, who might not be able to travel or might find it difficult to travel long distances. To offer it in a hybrid format gives a lot of people more access, especially those who might not be able to afford to do all of the traveling to, or afford the ticket that might be the in-person ticket. It's usually a little cheaper to do it online. And if you're doing live streaming and you have videos to watch, the awesome part about that is it doesn't matter if you go to the session at the same time as someone else, because you can see the video later, for someone who's presenting at the same time, which is a great aspect of a hybrid conference too. So I know a lot of teachers who have signed up for the online aspect of hybrid conferences because they have that access to all the sessions. So they don't have to pick just one person that's presenting at a certain time. They can go to all of them later on in the week or later on in the month. They can watch it when they want to. So that's a really, I think, a positive thing that's come out of COVID is that idea of accessibility and flexibility for conferences and professional development.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Danner. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. And thank you.
Thank you for having me.